A trip to the supermarket seemed to be just another ordinary afternoon for the residents of a small neighborhood in Ohio. Carts rolled smoothly down the illuminated aisles, filling the environment with the sound of wheels and the murmur of voices talking about promotions or dinner plans. The sun outside shone brightly, bathing the store's windows with a light that made the day even more routine. It was a typical scene where everyone seemed immersed in their own tasks, adjusting shopping lists or calculating prices on their phones. But, without anyone being able to predict it, this ordinary setting was about to be transformed in a profound and unexpected way. It all began when an elderly lady, with a firm expression and restrained gestures, approached a young woman in front of one of the shelves. And then, in a tone that carried more than words, a confrontation formed, something that would not only silence the conversations around, but also leave an impact that would change the day for everyone present in that store. Near the produce section, an elderly lady looking tired quickly and impatiently adjusted her glasses. Her face was marked by time, and her trembling hands held a bag of apples while she murmured something unintelligible to herself. The faded cardigan she wore and her carefully pinned silver hair gave her a simple, almost harmless appearance. However, what was about to happen would show that not everything was as unassuming as it seemed. A few steps away, a young black man casually approached, wearing a blue sweatshirt and jeans that seemed to have been chosen more for practicality than fashion. His name was Daryl. Tall and with a calm demeanor, he often went unnoticed, effortlessly blending into the store's rhythm. With a shopping basket balanced in one arm and his phone in the other hand, he typed messages while heading to the fruit section, stopping to grab a bag of oranges. Then it happened. The elderly lady turned abruptly, interrupting her task upon noticing Daryl's presence. Her gaze immediately changed, hardening with undeniable coldness. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips, once pursed, tightened into a hard, inflexible line. The break in her expression was so sudden, it seemed to carry an invisible force, capable of striking anyone nearby. "You don't belong here," she said, in a tone loud enough to be heard by everyone nearby. The impact was immediate. Daryl stopped typing, his fingers hovering over the phone as if time had frozen. He slowly raised his eyes, staring at the woman, but she did not stop. Instead, she continued, her voice becoming sharper. "Why don't you go back to Africa from where you came?" The store's atmosphere changed instantly. It was as if all sound had been sucked out of the environment, leaving behind a dense and awkward silence. Several shoppers halted their movements, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Some pretended not to hear, quickly diverting their eyes to their shopping lists, while others stood still, curious and incredulous at what was happening. Daryl, for his part, remained still. His face, once serene, slightly tensed, reflecting a mix of shock and disbelief. For a moment it seemed he would respond immediately, but something held him back. He took a deep breath, as if calculating every word he would say next. The lady, still holding her bag of apples, maintained a firm posture, her eyes fixed on Daryl as if challenging him to react. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Nearby, a young mother held her child's hand and discreetly led him to another section, while an elderly man standing next to a pile of potatoes nervously glanced from Daryl to the woman as if fearing an imminent explosion. Still, Daryl did not move. His basket still hung from one hand, and he seemed lost in thought for a brief moment, while the environment around him seemed to diminish. Every sound, the distant beep of a cashier scanning products, the clink of coins dropping, became muffled and irrelevant. All eyes were on him now, waiting for his reaction. However, the elderly lady showed no remorse. She adjusted her cardigan with an irritated gesture and lifted her chin, reinforcing her challenging stance. It was as if she did not expect him to respond, but was willing to maintain her position if he did. Further away, a young employee stacking bananas paused in the middle of his task, hesitant about whether to intervene. Another employee near the checkout stretched his neck to get a better view of what was happening. The tension, instead of dissipating, only increased as everyone present, even those pretending not to notice, were now captivated by the unfolding scene. Daryl finally broke the silence. He looked up at the woman, his expression calm but laden with a seriousness that could not be ignored. His presence seemed to grow, filling the space. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm, cutting through the environment like a sharp blade. "Madam, did you realize what you just said?" There was something almost meditative in his tone, as if he were genuinely giving the woman the opportunity to reflect on her words. But she did not seem willing to do so. "I said what I said," she retorted, her voice rising with an intensity that made some around shrink back. "This is my country, and people like you don't belong here. That's what I said." The murmuring among the shoppers became more audible. A young woman in the bread section sighed loudly, and others began to exchange uneasy glances. However, Darryl remained still. He did not approach the woman or raise his voice. He simply let the silence stretch again, giving weight to his words. "All right," he finally said, slowly nodding his head. His calm was disconcerting, a force that seemed to dominate the space. "Since you've brought this up, I think we should talk about it." As he said this, he carefully placed his basket on the ground, as if marking the beginning of something greater. The tension in the store reached its peak. The silent and hesitant audience seemed unable to divert their attention. Everyone was captivated by the magnetism of that unexpected exchange. Darryl fixed his eyes on the lady, but not with anger. There was a serene determination in his posture, something that made even the woman slightly recoil, adjusting uncomfortably in her position. What was to come was unpredictable, but everyone knew it would be something impossible to ignore. Darryl took a deep breath, maintaining his firm posture and calm tone, but his voice carried a strength that made his words penetrate deeply into the minds of those listening. He took a small step forward, deliberately shifting his body weight, and began, "You said I don't belong here." He paused, letting the words echo in the heavy supermarket atmosphere. "So, let me tell you something about where I come from." The surrounding silence was absolute. Every syllable seemed loaded with meaning, as if he had meticulously chosen each word before pronouncing it. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi." He left the sentence hanging in the air for a moment, watching the woman's reaction. He was a sharecropper, working from sunrise to sunset on land that wasn't his, breaking his back to give his children a chance at a better life. "And you know his father, a slave kidnapped from his homeland, beaten, sold as property." The elderly woman pressed her lips together, and her hands trembled slightly, but she said nothing. However, the impact of Darryl's words was evident to everyone around him. A man in the dairy section, who had been distracted by his phone until then, put the device down, his attention completely captured. An older couple exchanged glances, whispering discreetly as they continued to watch. Darryl continued, his voice gaining strength without losing the serenity that marked each sentence. "My great-grandfather helped build this country. He planted, harvested, built. All for what? So that the ground you're standing on now could exist." He made another pause, letting his words settle in the room. The supermarket sound seemed quieter now, as if even the machines and refrigerators respected the moment. "My grandfather? He fought in World War II. He risked his life for the country that sent him to the other side of the world. But when he came back..." Darryl took a deep breath, as if the weight of history was almost too much to bear. "When he came back, he couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same water fountains. Even so, he stayed. Do you know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when the country didn't believe in him." The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. The entire supermarket seemed to have frozen in time. "My parents, then, fought in another way." Darryl's tone softened, but the impact remained. "Not with weapons or fists, but by working every day. My mother is a teacher, spent her life teaching children no matter where they came from or what they were like. My father is a mechanic, the kind of man who would stop in the middle of the road to help someone like you if their car broke down." He fixed his gaze on the woman again, his expression now mixing firmness with a touch of sadness. "So you tell me I don't belong here, that I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Madam, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Perhaps even more because my family paid the price with blood, sweat, and tears so that this place could be what it is. The elderly woman's face was red now, her hands trembling as she held the bag of apples tighter. It was evident she wanted to say something, but seemed unable to find the words. The crowd around her, however, remained still, absorbing every detail of what was happening. Darryl took another deep breath, looking around. This time his words were not just for her, but for everyone. I could have walked away. His voice reached the farthest corners of the store, even without him raising it. But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't improve in silence. It's up to all of us to be better, better than this. The weight of his words fell on the crowd like a wave. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire supermarket seemed stuck in a collective trance. The elderly woman looked around as if seeking someone to support her, but found only silent and disapproving glances. It was then that a middle-aged man, wearing a baseball cap, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. He's right. His voice was hoarse but firm. We have to be better than this. This statement seemed to break the spell. An older woman near the frozen section nodded her head, her voice low but filled with emotion. My father fought in the same war. He always said the only color that mattered was the red of the flag. The murmuring in the crowd grew. A young cashier, looking to be no more than 20 years old, raised his voice from his station. I've never seen anyone handle something like this so gracefully. Thank you. The elderly woman, now clearly disturbed, held the cart tightly. Her expression showed anger, embarrassment, and perhaps a hint of shame. When she tried to speak, she seemed to hesitate, the words stuck in her throat. Darryl, however, showed no resentment. His expression was softer, and his voice, when he spoke again, was gentle. It's not about what you meant to say, ma'am. It's about how it sounded. Words matter, and actions matter even more. At that moment, a man at the deli counter began to clap. The sound echoed hesitantly at first, but soon was joined by others, until the entire store was clapping. It wasn't just for Darryl's words, but for the dignity with which he handled the hate and turned it into a lesson. The elderly lady looked around one last time before turning and pushing her cart toward the exit. Her face was pale, her steps more hesitant than before, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up with her. As she walked away, some people approached Darryl. A woman with teary eyes gently touched his shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Darryl offered a slight smile, lifting the shopping basket back into his hand. Sometimes, he said almost as if speaking to himself, it's not about winning or losing. It's about ensuring people hear the truth. The crowd began to slowly disperse. The tense silence that had filled the store gave way to a more peaceful reflection. Some shoppers continued with their tasks, but the look on their faces made it clear that something had changed. It wasn't just the end of an incident. It was the beginning of a memory, a lesson that would be etched for a long time. Darryl continued his shopping, moving with measured steps. The serenity in his posture contrasted with the emotional weight of what had just happened. When he reached the checkout line, he was greeted by a shy smile from the young employee who had spoken earlier. "What you said back there," the young man began, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "It meant a lot. Not everyone can face something like that, especially with such grace." Darryl returned the smile, his voice soft but full of conviction. Sometimes, grace is the only way to break through. Anger only builds walls. As Darryl left the supermarket, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows over the parking lot. He walked toward his car, but stopped upon noticing the elderly lady sitting in her vehicle, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he considered approaching her, but decided not to. Some lessons need time to mature, and he knew he had done his part. Later that night, Darryl sat at the kitchen table with his father, a man of few words and firm gestures. He recounted the day's events, every detail. His father listened attentively, hands crossed over the table, and after a moment of silence responded, "You did the right thing, son, not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her might not change overnight, but you planted a seed, and sometimes that's all we can do. Plant the seed and let it grow." Darryl nodded, reflecting on his father's words. He knew the encounter had been uncomfortable, but necessary. Ignorance does not disappear on its own, and silence only feeds it. Across town, the elderly lady sat at the dinner table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Daryl's words echoed in her mind, piercing the armor of convictions she had carried for so long. She thought of her grandchildren and the world they would inherit. For the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at the supermarket spread throughout the neighborhood. People commented on Daryl's courage and dignity. It wasn't just another incident, it was a catalyst for conversations that many had avoided. Daryl, for his part, did not seek attention or recognition. However, strangers approached him to thank him, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His simple yet powerful act inspired others to reflect on the impact of their words and actions. Even the elderly lady began to change. It wasn't immediate, but the experience made her question the beliefs she had held for so long. She didn't know if she would see Daryl again, but if she did, she hoped to have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it's about speaking calmly with conviction and letting the truth take its course. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding to create a better world.